So, Will.
Hello.
Thanks so much for coming on the show with us today.
My pleasure.
You're a prolific poet, podcaster, speaker, and a writer, if I'm correct. Is there anything else that you get up to on that list?
Those are the main things. I like to think that, mix of writing, speaking, and collaborating with others, sort of do some short film stuff, but I just bring the words in those spaces.
Wonderful. Tell us a little bit about yourself. What came first?
Yeah, well, if we go way back, I grew up in Canberra. My mum was a librarian. I said this super nerdy thing when I was a kid. I said to her that if I could ever get just locked up in one place for the rest of my life, it would be in a library. And she, as a librarian, thought that was the greatest thing ever. But always just drawn to language. And then when I was in early high school, I had a defining moment in my life when somebody burnt me a Tupac CD. I was in year 8. I went home and I just remember like listening to the storytelling through his lyrics and just being absolutely hooked. So that probably planted a little seed, and kind of the general interest in words became much more in hip hop.
Yep.
And then, I wanted to be the greatest rapper ever, walk around my school kind of just freestyling with somebody else who could kind of half beatbox, and it's very embarrassing to look back on.
Incredible.
But then I had a teacher when I was in year 12 who said you should enter this poetry slam, and I hadn't heard of slam poetry at the time. It was pretty fresh in Australia. This is like maybe 12 years ago. And I just went along. I just took one of my raps and did it without any music or anything, and got exposed to other people who were performing their poetry, and that was probably like the thing that really stuck. So I still do spoken word poetry, and that's probably the center of everything I do. All the creative stuff I do, I kind of talk about like that's the center of gravity that everything else revolves around.
Amazing. Incredible. Because I guess one of the biggest differences between poetry and lyrics is that poetry is meant to be experienced against the contrast of silence. So is that something that drew you to that? Because you don't call yourself a rapper.
No,
So
I mean, I think there's a few things about it that I love. Like, obviously, I still love hip hop, but generally it's about being on beat.
Yeah.
It's writing 16 bar verses, 4 beats a bar, kind of sticking to that. And that's awesome. And you can experiment with that a bit. But I guess in a spoken word setting, you can shock people by taking a big long pause, or by completely changing your pacing, or by dipping in and out of different styles of writing.
Yeah.
So just the freedom of that. And then I think I just loved the idea. The first poetry slam I went to, I saw a real diversity of poets. I remember there was an Australian freestyle bush poet.
Amazing.
There was, a retired, woman. There was a refugee. There's like this real diverse mix. And so all of their styles were completely different, and yet everyone in the room was drawn into just that person's voice and their story. So don't get me wrong, I still love hip hop. I still love listening to somebody,
Yeah.
spit over beats. But
you do think it
the
confines in a way, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or it just gives a framework
Yeah.
that spoken word can break free from, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have many videos, but in your video YOLO, I found it quite interesting because the whole concept is trying to give more responsibility or entrusting responsibility to young people. And it kind of spurred this idea in me. Do you think you have to have lived at least a great number of years to make good art, or not necessarily? Like if we're going to take it, just like kind of interweave the concepts there, or not so much?
That is a blast from the past.
Yeah.
So I wrote that at a time in my life, probably close to 10 years ago. I felt like I had lots of people telling me that I was too young, and I did a lot of things young. I got married when I was 22. I kind of had a pretty clear idea of things I wanted to do, and so I wrote that poem.
Yeah.
Kind of pushing back against some of the like low expectations that we have of young people. But interestingly, like I've now written poems. I wrote another poem at the time, like there was a letter to my future self. A little while ago, I wrote a letter back to my younger self, because your perspective changes.
Of course.
And, so whilst I still think we could up our expectations of young people, I also now see that as time has gone on, I'm like, like there's no rush.
Yeah.
So I feel like a lot of art is a conversation with yourself and with the way that you change and evolve over time.
Yeah.
And I just feel like definitely, even if you're making great art when you're X age, art is about continuing to show up, continuing to refine your practice. And so it doesn't mean you can't make something great when you're 5 years old. Like my 5-year-old comes out with some amazing lines of poetry that he's just speaking. He looks at like a plane flying through the sky and he says, it's tearing the sky.
Oh, wow.
My man, that's some good poetry from my 5-year-old son. But if he shows up to the page, or if he shows up to whatever his practice is over decades, the way that integrates,
absolutely,
that evolving conversation with ourselves is what comes out.
So where do you think art comes from?
Well, I definitely use the word conversation a lot. I think art begins with our experience of the world, our observations. I don't think that we start it. You know, I think I'm pretty drawn to the idea that when it comes to creativity, like there's 3 primary colours and we just rearrange them. Yeah. There's 12 notes in the, standard musical scale.
That's cool.
And we just rearrange them. And there's, most of the time when I write, I'm not inventing new words, try and do that occasionally for a bit of fun, but usually it's just about the arrangement. So I think art comes from like taking what you've got, observing, and then participating in a conversation and listening back and realizing that you change, you evolve over time. I was very confident when I started doing spoken word. A lot of my poems were much more kind of self-righteous, just telling everyone how it is. And nowadays they're probably a lot more just like, I have a lot more questions than answers. I'm trying to explore that and how those things have changed over time. So it comes from listening, observing, and then being willing to...
Yeah. But there's obviously a spiritual element as well. Do you believe that?
Definitely.
Yeah. So it's a balance of like the conversation with humans, but then also tapping into your form of spirituality.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's interesting. So what's your biggest challenge with poetry then?
My biggest challenge? I think that like any artist or any creative, as time goes on, your inner critic... becomes stronger through certain seasons. And I feel like, we were talking about it before, like when I was in high school, I was very into freestyle rap. And when you freestyle rap, you don't have time to insert that voice in your head that says that idea is not worth sharing. You just learn to get around that. I think that was a super helpful thing early on as a writer, to just learn to just put it out there and then just be okay with the fact that some of it was inevitably going to be really crap. But as time goes on, you sort of get more and more of that, like, I have to be as good as that thing I did in the past that people liked, or I have to...
as good as your last game sort of thing.
Exactly,
Interesting.
And it becomes more of, it does become, I think, more of like a performance. You're trying to fulfill the persona that you think other people see of you, rather than just being curious and rather than just being, creating to explore your inner world and the things happening around you. And
absolutely.
So I think that's one of the big challenges now is how do I actually recapture just the wonder of exploring myself
really
and stuff around me.
Because it's like attaching to a timeline in some senses, where it's like every creation is the first and the last as far as you know. And so it's really, I can relate being an artist as well. That's cool. Let's jump across to your podcast. You've taken a break to it, but you had Poetic Beans going there and you interviewed lots and lots of people. What was one of the hardest things about running a podcast?
Well, I have actually done a number of podcasts, and I kind of have a few on the go at any one point in time.
Okay.
I am definitely a pretty scattered creative, doing too many things and not necessarily finishing a bunch of them.
Amazing.
Yeah, so that particular podcast was a bit of a passion project though. So what I did was I interviewed people, and then I basically wrote poems that, you know, were kind of an attempt to capture that person's story in the form of a poem. And then I put it into a book, and got Grant Maloney to do
I'm going to
pictures
ask
of
you
the
about
arts
that.
of the hands. But yeah, I think that was a really great process of just, for me, like any podcast is about trying to draw out things out of a person that, you know, kind of, they're a gold mine and you're digging for the gold.
Yeah.
But to do that with the listening ear of there's a poem here. And every person I sit with, there's always a poem here. And if I'm listening well to the little phrases and to the little stories and the way their body language might light up at certain moments, then I can kind of be getting to know that person as the piece of art. You know, and in some ways, it's sort of like I'm discovering the poem more than writing it, just by listening and trying to arrange it. So
that's incredible. That's really, really cool. I do want to ask you about those books actually as well, because I read about those. There's 2 books, right? Yeah. So Poetic Beings and All Things New. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, so I've got 2 books. All Things New is kind of my collection of, a selection of poems from like a decade of my life. And there's a lot held in that decade, you know, in that little decade I wrote poems about being young and, you know, not liking other people, having low expectations around what I could do with my life. I became a dad. I've got 2 sons. You know, I moved from my hometown. I lost my granddad. You know, there's sort of all sorts of things that happened in that 10 years. So that collection of poetry is pretty special, and I'm still really, really proud of that book.
Yeah.
And if I was going to tell people to buy one of the books, that is the better one in terms of poetry.
Yeah.
The other one's more like a creative concept album, if you were to think of it that way, where it's pretty niche.
Okay.
You know, it's these poems that are written out of these interviews about specific people. So it's a bit more of a creative challenge for me, rather than being sort of the greatest hits of my poetry, if that makes sense.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
For me, it's more interesting because I love poetry and I can appreciate it. But this slogan or this statement gets thrown around quite often that poetry's dead. You know, so you published some poetry books. Can you tell us why poetry isn't dead?
Yeah, well, I've spent a lot of time, you know, trying to convince people that that's not the case.
Yeah.
The reason why I think people do think poetry is dead, before, you know, flipping it around to why I don't think it is, is when a lot of us, and it is changing, but a lot of us in school, you know, if I was to ask you right now, like, which poets can you remember studying at school, or which poets can you name?
Yeah, true.
Who comes to mind?
Honestly, I'm not even proud of my school. Like that one, my English class was a flop, so that's an answer for you right there. You know. You know,
most of the time people say Shakespeare.
Yeah.
They say Banjo Patterson.
Yeah.
They might say Robert Frost. But generally they pretty much all say dead white guys.
Yeah.
And so if the only poets you can name, or the first poets you can name, died hundreds of years ago, even if their work was great, you probably think that poetry is something that's just a part of history.
Yeah.
Whereas if I was to ask you which musicians you know, or which actors you know, like, you would name people that are living, even though you might be able to name people that died, you know, that were musicians at one point in time.
Yeah.
So it's just like, it's a weird that that's the art form where we learn it more through history than current. And what changed that for me was, you know, hip hop artists were alive.
Yeah.
Spoken word poets, you know, on YouTube or whatever. Like, there's a big slam poetry scene in the States, and I could watch those at home, you know, through YouTube.
For sure.
And so that was the thing that made me realize poetry's not dead. It's just changed where it hangs out.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that, like, all lyrics are poetry.
That's a line for you right there. It's just changed where it's hanging out. That's great.
Yeah.
That's
and then I like when I talk to high school students about poetry and try to intervene so that they, you know, don't don't grow up hating poetry.
Yeah.
You know, I talk about, well, if you look at a speech like Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, it has all the qualities of a great poem or a great spoken word piece. There's repetition, there's metaphors, there's, you know, the way that he delivers it is embodied, it's passionate. So yeah, it's just about our perception. Poetry's definitely not dead, it's just, where is it?
Do you think there's a perception, because when I was like mulling on this question to give to you, do you think there's a perception that perhaps it's elitist or it's like always interwoven with politics? Like, do you think a reason that it's snubbed is because people are like, oh, it's pretense?
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
like, oh, you're so educated, you know poetry.
Yeah, it definitely, that's part of, I think, what became problematic is that poetry did become an academic kind of art form, and maybe because it so lends itself to like critiquing it and kind of having these kind of lofty conversations about a poem rather than just experiencing it. One of the reasons I love, you know, live performed poetry is you're not thinking about how many syllables are in the line or whether it's iambic pentameter or these sort of things. You're just asking, did I feel something?
Yeah,
Did I experience it? Did I sit in the moments of silence and feel the power of it? So yeah, I think that the whole reason that it became maybe wrapped up in the academic world, it's sort of also what has changed things is the guy who started slam poetry is a guy named Mark Smith. He started, you know, slam poetry in the 80s in Chicago. He used to go to these poetry readings where he's like, even the poet is falling asleep. It is boring. It is dry. It is really clinical. So let's get back to, you know, how things used to be, where poetry was very much the language of the common people. And so, you know, the idea of slam poetry is that anybody can perform, anybody can rock up to the venue, put their name on the list and have their 2 minutes. And the judges are just chosen randomly from the audience. You don't have to have some sort of degree in poetry or literature. You just be, you know, some random person and you get to decide, did it move you or was it shit? And that's really how it should be. Anybody can play and anybody can have an opinion.
Yeah, that's interesting. Am I correct to say that poetry birthed out as a tool to remember long pieces of storytelling? So like the rhythmic nature.
Yeah.
Have you heard of this?
I haven't heard that, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so storytelling, obviously, people would get up. I'm not sure of what period this was. They'd get up on a stage or to announce to a crowd of people and to pass on the metaphor, what they'd learnt on their voyage. They invented this rhythm so that they could remember it.
Wow. Makes a lot of sense. I mean, people ask me, one of the most common questions people ask me is, how did you memorize that poem?
Yeah.
Or how have you got all that in your head? And I'm like, well, my mind put together those rhymes and that rhythm, it was easy to remember.
Yeah.
And so that totally makes sense.
It's just like a long mnemonic, basically.
Yeah.
That's cool. Can you recommend some poets for people listening?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I love Mary Oliver.
Okay.
People haven't read Mary Oliver. She's brilliant. I definitely my mind goes to lyricists and I still have a big, you know, spot in my heart for Tupac, but these days, you know, I love people like Chance the Rapper and in terms of Aussie stuff, one of my favourite MCs is, I love Horror Show and, what's his name? Solo from Horror Show. He's a great lyricist.
Yeah.
In terms of other, like, you know, people want to go through classics like T.S. Eliot, sort of surrealist poetry that I really dig. But yeah, my number one recommendation is Mary Oliver. Yeah. Good for the soul.
Wow, okay, I'll definitely check that out. Have you heard of Kate Tempest?
Yeah.
What do you think about her?
She's great, yeah, and all the people I just said were more like book poetry. So
that's
in terms of spoken word, Kate Tempest is great. Omar Musa was somebody who really sort of encouraged me when I was, you know, just getting into it. He's one of the Australian Poetry Slam champions from a few years back. Luca Lesson, Candy Royale, this poet that passed away a couple of years ago now, I think. But she's an amazing Australian voice. I mean, there's so many now. Yeah.
Incredible. I just want to swing across to your blog writing now. I read one of your articles and you did a beautiful one because you're a father to some wonderful children, and you did a blog about fatherhood, and I was wondering, it's a tumultuous time for everyone, but I think especially for men and fathers. Do you have some advice for young fathers, because you were a young father, and just something to share?
Yeah, I mean, parenting, it's hard to give advice because it's kind of like inevitable that it's just going to break you down and then hopefully you'll build back up. You know, for me, like the biggest thing I think I need to hear often as a parent is just to be present. And I probably need to hear that in other areas of my life as well, to actually slow myself down, try and slow down my like creative brain to just enjoy the simple beauty of the moment. A huge part of my parenting journey, I guess, and I've got another podcast that explores this a lot called Mankind, but I always imagined that I would be a dad of daughters. Don't know, you know, for some reason that was just what was in my head. And I have two sons, and when my first son was born, it's like I sort of went on this bit of a journey of like realizing that my expectations were that I'd be a better dad to daughters, and sort of starting to ask, why is that?
That's so fascinating.
Think maybe I don't feel like I have a lot of manhood to pass on. I'm not very manly, according to certain stories about what manhood is or what it should be. And realizing that, I really wanted to do everything I could to help my sons or whatever kids I have to grow up without being forced into a certain mold really early. So I've written poems and blog posts as well about both of my kids have long hair and are constantly confused. You know, people will say you have beautiful daughters. And sometimes I want to react to that and say, no, he's a boy, he's my son. And other times I'm like, I want to react to myself and just go like, why does it matter? Like, you know? So a big part of my parenting journey, and probably anyone's really, is that it forces you to reflect back, or you can choose not to. I guess this would be my advice, is take the opportunity to look back at the stories you grew up within and work out whether or not you want to change them, whether or not you want to help your kids to have a different narrative for how they make sense of the world and who they are. Yeah,
that's incredible, and like perspective I haven't thought about before, the expectation of the child you're going to have. That's interesting. Cool. Do you want to tell us what you're working on now then? You mentioned Mankind podcast. What else are you up to?
Yeah, so there's another season of that which is about to come out. It's Mankind with a semicolon in the middle, because the idea is kind of about what if manhood wasn't associated with aggression or strength, but with kindness, compassion, things like that. So there's some really great interviews that are about to come out with the next sort of batch of those episodes. I am working at the moment with Headspace, Australia's youth mental health foundation, and doing a really, sort of big project that is all around creating content to help young people make it through these strange times we're living in. So, we've just done a sort of poetry video about, you know, the idea that we made it to here, and that's worth celebrating, that there's so much crazy stuff we've been through that, wow, the fact that you got out of bed this morning, well done. Going to do a podcast as part of that project, and we're doing a bunch of storytelling films of different young people sharing their mental health story. So that's the big one. And then I'm just trying to, I guess, at the moment, I don't have a particular poetry project in mind, but I just try and write a poem every week and, you know, just try and have that personal practice. And I'm sure that there'll be another book or something that comes out of that at some point soon.
Incredible. My final question is, why the Central Coast? You moved here from Canberra, you've stayed. What's great about the coast? Why do you love it?
Yeah, I mean, I love the coast, and I don't fully know why it was the place that we chose to move. I guess there were a few, you know, little factors. It's kind of like far enough away from where I grew up, but close enough. So it's kind of just that right mix geographically. But
much warmer.
Much warmer.
Okay.
Like to any Canberran, living near the ocean is an amazing, you know, luxurious thing. Nice. So I still feel like that. Yeah. I think that shortly after moving here, I was just lucky enough to meet the right people I think I was at the right point in my creative journey as well, where it was sort of like, I don't know, the place you grow up, and some people live where they live their whole life, and that's fine. But I feel like Canberra really saw me as an awkward teenager figuring myself out, finding my voice, figuring out what I wanted to do. And when I came here, that's an ongoing process, but it was sort of like I arrived at a point where I felt like I had a voice to offer, things to say, and I connected with the right people. So I love it here in terms of the nature. I love it here in terms of community. I see that there is so much potential for cultural growth, and often there's that temptation to sort of feel like I could be somewhere where it's more happening, but it's kind of like here that the slow burn is building. And that can be a really exciting time to be part of a place when it's going through change, and when you can be a part of, I guess, putting your fingerprints on an evolving culture. So I love that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Did you want to recite a poem for us, or even freestyle, whatever you feel?
Yeah, I'll share a poem.
Whatever you're feeling.
I'll share a poem that it kind of ties together a few of the threads we talked about. This is a poem for my son Noah about hair. This is a poem about hair. It may sound superficial, but there's more to the story. These strands of thread are tied to the thoughts we think as we try to categorize each other. And the maker of all knows all by number, but this poem was born for my firstborn Bubba. When he first entered the world, he had glorious, thick, dark hair like his mama. And she said, let's not cut it until at least 2 years old. Let it be wild, like the heart of our child. And so it grew, and it said something about being free. But the boxes come early. Things must fit. We must see the world through the lenses we get. So as my boy made his way through the world looking free, people began to say, wow, isn't she a beautiful daughter you have? And I, fresh dad, traipsed through mental mazes as I heard their comments, saw their gazes, thought to myself, this is son, not daughter, boy, not girl. Why are we so quick to divide up the world over arbitrary factors like the length of the curls? And I felt a little discomfort over the confusion, but then I felt a little more discomfort over my internal response. Like, if I care so much when these mistakes are made, am I just feeding into this system of simplistic division? And so I decided, I want to be wild. I want to be free. So rather than my boy just bearing the image of me, it is I who would like to become more like he. So out grew the locks, up went the man bun, wild and wavy like father, like son. A small act of saying to the children I parent that though our external differences may be most apparent, the length of our hair or the colour of our skin, the clothes that we wear, our favourite things, these do not change the deep stuff we carry within. We're all bundles of the same deep stuff within. And so this is a poem about hair. But it's also about being wild and free. Whether you rock dreadlocks, a man bun, a mullet or fade, whether your hair is hot pink, blonde, brunette, ranger or grey, may it just be one of the ways that you say, the way that I am is perfectly okay. Whether you are he, she, or don't fit either so cleanly, may you know who you are and learn to love yourself freely.
Woo!
Yes.
So good, captivating. Thank you so much for coming today and speaking with us and sharing your beautiful poetry.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.